Kinko side of the FedEx Corporation, but being on the Kinko side even prior to the merger, after the merger has given me a great deal of insight and a great deal of information regarding the FedEx Corporation. We heard the talk about the hedging and the fuel and British Airways. How many of you understand or realize that in terms of airlines, FedEx Corporation is actually the world's single largest airline? Most people don't think of that. We don't carry passengers. But in terms of the number of planes, the number of pilots, the number of hours flown, we are the single largest airline in the world. We have over 700 planes in our fleet. So when you hear them talking about airlines and hedging and fuel, we know a little bit about that. That's been one of our key strategies as well over the last dozen years, as well as Southwest. As he said, Southwest probably has done it better than anybody in the industry from a passenger standpoint. In today's world, though, it's getting a little bit more difficult because basically what you're doing when you hedge is prepaying for oil. You're betting that I'm going to pay you $140 for this barrel of oil today, and I'm going to pay you that price for enough for a certain period of time on the bet that it's going to continue to go up. At FedEx, we've actually reduced our hedging capabilities. Even though we're still cash positive, we've reduced it because we're less willing to take that bet that oil is going to continue to skyrocket. We do see a steady climb in the near future, but not enough of one to continue hedging for 5 years like we were a couple of years ago. So we've actually reduced our hedging a little bit. But mergers and acquisitions, with the credit crunch that's upon us, you're seeing less mergers and acquisitions today. And actually, I'm not 100% sure why. I think that as we just talked about with the airlines, that's going to have to be a strategy going forward that is going to allow companies to consolidate, in many cases, their support expenses. As we talked about the airline industry just a moment ago, and the proposed merger between Northwest and Delta, they're not reducing any of their operating expenses. The number of planes is going to stay primarily the same. The number of pilots is going to stay primarily the same. What they're going to reduce is their support cost. If you've read some of the news articles, they're going to reduce the corporate overhead. They're going to combine their corporate offices into one. They're going to, in essence, reduce the number of jobs, but all those jobs are going to be a support cost, not an actual operating cost. So as you look at mergers and acquisitions, you've got to actually take back the two operating companies, or the two operating entities. You've got the support entity that's going to support the business as a whole and make sure that we continue to make profitable decisions. But then you've got the actual operations expenses. And in most cases, those actual operating expenses can't be combined, especially as you look at airline industries or the package delivery industry, which is what FedEx is in, the cargo industry. Let's take a step back a little bit and think about FedEx and FedEx Kinkos. There's really a couple of key things I wanted to cover with you this evening about our merger and acquisition that we have had take place over the last few years. It is very difficult when you start talking about mergers and acquisitions, really when you start talking about merging the corporate cultures. Northwest and Delta, JP Morgan and Bear Stearns, you have companies that merge or that get bought and that have very different corporate cultures. And sometimes it's very, very successful. Sometimes it's not such a successful merger. The jury, according to the analyst on Wall Street, is still out about our company. FedEx paid a little over $2 billion US for the Kinkos company when they bought us. At the time, a lot of analysts said that that was an overpayment, that they were doing it in a knee-jerk reaction to the UPS company buying the mailboxes, etc. franchise when they bought them for their retail point of access. As a Kinkos person, I tend to say they didn't overbuy us, that they actually paid a good price for us, and I appreciate it because I enjoy working for FedEx. But we have two very distinct corporate cultures in our two organizations, and they have not merged very well to this point. Now, it's starting to get much better today, but the first 24 to 36 months after our merger and acquisition was very, very difficult. Let me give you a little bit of background why. Let's start with the Kinkos company. We have been in business at FedEx Kinkos for about 36 years. We were started by a gentleman named Paul Orfila in California, in the United States. Our first store was actually the sidewalk in front of a taco shop at UC Berkeley. And it's a pretty interesting story. Paul bought a couple of copiers, and on the lunch breaks at the restaurant, when all the students would walk by, he'd roll the copiers out front with an extension cord and make copies as the students walked by and needed them. Paul was a pretty free spirit. He liked to have a good time, liked to enjoy what he did. and really built the company around that philosophy. When you look at today's corporate world and corporate environment and the rules and regulations that most companies have, professionalism, that wasn't a Kinko's hallmark for many, many years. Probably the first 25 years or so of our company's existence. We have people in our company that will tell you stories about their first job at Kinko's was washing Paul's dog. He hired somebody to work for Kinko's to come in every Friday, and he brought his dogs in, and that was their job, to give them baths. Not exactly the type of corporate story that you want to tell people as you're recruiting for high-level positions, probably. But it was a good time. Obviously, as you can imagine, being in California in the 60s and 70s, Paul ran a pretty loosey-goosey ship. There was a lot of fun, a lot of people wearing shorts to work. It's just a very casual environment. And that continued all the way up until about 6 years ago, when we started really trying to bring people into a corporate culture. It didn't work very well. There was a lot of people that remembered the good old days, as you'll hear a lot of companies talk about. And our good old days were days that didn't have a lot of structure to them. But we knew as we looked forward coming into the 2000s that if we didn't change that, if we didn't look forward instead of looking backwards, then we were in an industry that was going to put us in a position of disadvantage to our competitors. So we started making some of these changes, and we started becoming a more professional organization. And about that same time is when FedEx really started looking at us as a potential acquisition. FedEx and Kinkos have a very long history. We've had a history of cooperation for 30 years. In many of our centers in the United States, we actually had a FedEx shipping counter long, long before the acquisition. It's been a great partnership, and that's really what led to the beginning discussions of the acquisition. On FedEx's history, I don't know how many of you have heard the story, but the story goes that Mr. Smith, who's our CEO and founder, was in a master's class, much like this one, and as part of his thesis, he did a paper on the need and the value of an overnight document delivery service, and turned it into his professor. And depending on who you listen to, depending on who tells the story, he either received a C or an F on the paper. Now, I've never heard Mr. Smith tell the story, so I don't know which one of those is true, but I have a feeling that those who say he received an F are saying it for theatrical value. I think he probably did receive a C on the paper. However, I do know that whatever his grade was, he wasn't very happy with that grade, so he went out, got some money from a bank, and started up his own regional airline. Actually bought a regional airline in Arkansas and started the first overnight document delivery service. And that was around the same time that Paul Orfila was starting Kinko's out in California. So we have two companies that have a very similar time frame as far as our history, but a very different corporate culture. The FedEx corporate culture from the day from the day Fred Smith started it was very much a corporate structure. He was a business person, and he treated his business like a business. He took care of his team members. He installed a philosophy, a managing philosophy of PSP, people, service, profit. You take care of your people will provide great service. If you provide great service to your customers, they'll provide you with financial returns, profit. Very simple operating philosophy, one that a lot of companies have tried to emulate over the years. Some have done so successfully, some haven't. We've done it very successfully, fortunately. You come to the year 2003, and FedEx decides to buy Kinko's. And FedEx, at the time, only sees the 1,200 storefront locations that they're going to be getting, that retail entry into the shipping network into the United States. The Kinko stores in the 8 countries worldwide that we're in, including Japan with our locations here. Yes, part of the purchase was a response to UPS, a purchase of mailbox, etc. It was a little bit of an arms race to keep up with each other in the ever-growing world of retail shipping versus the business shipping that we do so well. But what they didn't see was the two different cultures. And when you try to take a very free-spirited culture and merge it into a very corporate structured culture, you're going to have some problems. And we did, and that's been the single biggest challenge to our merger and acquisition has been those two cultures. I'm a little bit fortunate. I came to our organization from a couple of other Fortune 500 companies in the U.S. At the time I joined the Kinko's organization, we were starting to make that migration to more of a corporate culture. Had we stayed with our previous culture, I probably wouldn't have made it for very long in our company because it's not something I enjoy. I enjoy a little bit more of the structure, a little bit more of the corporate world. And there's a lot of people that feel that way, But one of the greatest assets of my company is the tenure of our team members. We have team members in our organization that have been with our company for 25 and 30 years. Now, you don't find very many companies that you can say that in, but both of ours, FedEx and Kinkos, can both say that. The great thing about that is the industry knowledge and the business knowledge and the customer knowledge that you have when you have team members that have that level of tenure. One of the downsides is trying to make changes. There's a saying in the U.S., you can't teach old dogs new tricks, and certainly we don't want to refer to any of our team members as dogs, but we do have some team members that are very set in their ways, and that remember the good old days, and that don't want to be part of a corporate culture now. So as FedEx has tried to push their corporate culture onto Kinkos, there have been many in the Kinkos world that have resisted it. Now that's a good thing and a bad thing in some ways. It's certainly a bad thing when you look at the need for consistency in a worldwide brand. In a multinational corporation such as ours, one of the hallmarks of any multinational corporation is consistency across their brand in any country they operate in. If you look at Starbucks in Japan looks and feels the same as a Starbucks in Europe. It looks the same as a Starbucks in the United States. It looks the same as a Starbucks in Latin America. They may have some regionalized differences on their menu, but the look and feel and the experience, customer experience, is the same worldwide. We have had trouble getting that same level of consistency in our merger and acquisition simply because of the team members' reluctance to take on the FedEx corporate culture. And when you have a reluctance to take on that corporate culture, there's two ways that you can deal with it. FedEx tried the first one, which is forcing it on someone. This is our culture. You're going to do it. You don't have a choice. We're going to make you do it. Well, that didn't actually work very well. We had a lot of team members that resisted that from day one. And when you hit something over and over and over again, eventually it starts to hit back, and that's what our team members did. So then FedEx finally took a step back and said, okay, didn't work so well the first time when we tried to make you accept our corporate culture, Mr. Kinko's team member. How about if we take a step back and explain to you why this is a good thing, why you need to come to our side, to accept our culture, what we're going to do for you. FedEx Kinkos is about a $2 billion US company. FedEx as a whole is a $40 billion US company. So FedEx is able to provide a level of investment and a level of financial security to our team members at Kinkos that Kinkos as our own company would have never been able to provide had we not been part of the merger and acquisition. A $2 billion US company is not going to be able to invest $500 million on research and development projects for their future the way a $40 billion company will be able to invest in for you. So as we took the two cultures and we took a step back and we started explaining why we needed our Kinkos team members to be part of the FedEx family, why PSP and our people service profit philosophy was the right way to do business, why it was the best thing for our customers, for our team members to start taking that philosophy into their daily dealings with them, we started to see the change. We started to see the light bulb go on. We started to see team members that have been with our company for 25 years act differently, which was a huge bonus for both of the organizations. FedEx Kinkos was FedEx Corporation's 5th acquisition. Anytime that we started a new company or a new operating company, it was generally through an acquisition. When we started FedEx Ground in the United States, we didn't just go out and buy our own trucks and hire our own drivers. We bought a company called RPS, Roadway Packaging Services. When we wanted to expand our express services in the United States, again, we didn't go out and buy more planes and hire more pilots. We bought a company called Flying Tigers. Recently, unfortunately bad timing, right before the credit crunch and the bubble that we've got going on right now with freight, we went out and bought a company called Watson Trucking for a freight company. So instead of investing your own money and building up a startup network and having to build up a support structure, one of the best ways to do growth in companies that are looking to get into new arenas is through merger and acquisition versus doing it as a startup. It would have been much more expensive at FedEx to have gone into each of those individual operating companies or operating arenas and built up a complete support network from the ground up and went into each of those arenas as a mini startup versus having to go in and actually buy another company. To do that, though, you have to be cash solvent. And that's one of the things as we get back to the airlines that they were talking about today, Northwest and Delta, United and Continental, Americans and Continental. Continental's talked to a couple of different partners. The key thing right now that's holding back mergers and acquisitions around the world is a lack of capital. Because one company has to buy the other company. And if the credit crunch continues to go along and the credit is tightened to the point where people aren't allowed to buy or to borrow from the banks like they need to be, you'll continue to see mergers and acquisitions reduce more than they are today. In the early 2000s on Wall Street, there were approximately 200 mergers and acquisitions a year for a couple of years. We have seen that reduce in 2007 to low double digits. And the primary reason is because people do not have the cash right now to continue with the merger and acquisition process like they did in the early 2000s when the economy was really rolling. So you've got to have the cash to buy the company, but beyond that, merging the two cultures has to be the primary focus, and you have to buy the right company. Northwest and Delta will be an interesting experiment. I happen to fly Northwest and Continental both coming over to Japan because both of the airlines service Tokyo and Narita quite well. I will tell you firsthand that I prefer flying Northwest to Continental, even though Continental gives me a direct flight back into Houston. So to see Northwest merge with a company other than Continental is actually a pleasant surprise to me. Northwest and Continental were in talks for a little while, and I was not sure I was going to appreciate that as a customer. The one thing that we try to do at FedEx Kinkos is we look at our mergers and acquisitions, and there will be more. Fred Smith has committed that we are going to continue to grow as a company, and when we continue to grow, we'll do it both organically and through mergers and acquisitions. We have committed, though, after the Kinkos acquisition, to make sure that we look at more than just bottom lines and top lines when we look at mergers and acquisitions. Again, the Kinkos acquisition was really the first one where the cultures didn't mix, but they never had really had to look at the cultures before because it had never been an issue. So it kind of caught everybody by surprise. One of the biggest things for me personally has been being on the side of a smaller company that was bought by the larger company. One of the things you have to appreciate is the job opportunities that it opens. Again, going from an employee of a $2 billion US company to one of a $40 billion US company with 5 separate operating companies opens up career opportunities, not only for people at my level, but for people at the team member level. We have, again, retail teams here in Japan and around the world that now have an opportunity to not just grow up in the Kinkos tree, but to grow up in any part of our organization. And when you look at a career path that that can provide, it becomes a very powerful recruiting tool. Now I'm no longer recruiting somebody to come to work for FedEx Kinkos, which has 20,000 team members around the world in 8 countries. I'm recruiting somebody to come to work for FedEx, which has 280,000 team members in 220 countries around the world. If you would have told me 4 years ago that today I would be standing in Japan as the managing director of FedEx Kinkos in Japan, I would have told you you were crazy. But we have a lot of people in the world who want that opportunity, including myself, as I had the opportunity to come to Japan, to go experience other cultures and to put themselves in positions that are outside their comfort zone, to travel. And when you give somebody the opportunity to come to work for a company that has 220 countries that they can do business in, it's almost unlimited. If I wanted to tomorrow, I could get a hold of somebody in the Express network and I could be working in a country in Africa or in Latin America. And any one of our team members has that same opportunity. So companies are starting to realize that. And they're starting to realize that beyond just the business world, beyond just the paycheck, that the team that they have working for them are looking for life experiences. In the 70s and 80s, it was the Peace Corps. Everybody wanted to join the Peace Corps to go get the international experience and to have that while they were young. Today, it's the professional people. I get inquiries from the team in the United States probably 2 or 3 times a month of a team member in the United States that's taking a Japanese master's course wanting to come to Japan and work for our team and immerse himself in the culture here. I've sent team members from Japan to the U.S. on assignments. We have a gentleman right now in China that is an American director in China that went over there. So being part of a multinational corporation that is going to go through mergers and acquisitions and grow through mergers and acquisitions gives your team members from all levels of the organization career opportunities that they might have never ever had they stayed, had the merger and acquisition not happened. The Kinkos acquisition was also unique on a couple of other fronts. One of the most challenging parts of this acquisition for our company has been the fact that you took a transportation company, FedEx, that had zero retail experience. It was simply a cargo company. It moved freight, it moved packages, it moved letters, and you added a retail network. And FedEx really had zero experience managing a retail network prior to the acquisition. Nobody in FedEx's organization had ever managed a retail storefront, had ever managed a retail organization, had ever been part of a retail business. And that was one of the things that when they went through the merger and acquisition process, when they were going through the negotiations, the story can be told now that that did come up, but that Mr. Smith and some of the other top executives actually discounted it, and discounted the amount of work it took to run a retail organization versus running simply a professional cargo organization. To run a retail organization that relies on customers walking in the front door and you selling them a product that they need is much different than walking into a company that needs to ship a letter from California to New York and have it there the next morning. It's two completely different business environments. And the fact that FedEx didn't have that experience was another thing that caused this acquisition to take longer to merge than it should have. By not having that experience, by not having that ability to manage on a retail level, they came in and immediately started trying to put in some of their business practices on top of a retail organization that just didn't make sense, quite frankly. They'll tell you today it didn't make sense and that they should have done some things differently, but at the time, it was really a sense of we're a big company that's bought a small company and we know what's best for you and this is how we run our organization. Again, going back to the this is how we do it and you need to do it our way versus trying to see it both ways. Again, it was unique because of all the other acquisitions they had made over the course of time. Those acquisitions had always been transportation companies, had never been retail companies, and it had never really been thought of. It was an afterthought. So when we at Kinkos started coming back with pushback to some of the things that they were asking us to do from a transportation standpoint, they didn't understand it. And it took the senior management of both companies 12 to 18 months to get in to the point where they could sit in the same room and understand the challenges that each of the companies faced. I'll be the first to admit as a Kinkos guy, it was probably 2 years after the acquisition before I had any idea really how the management structure of FedEx worked as an express company, as a transportation company. They just didn't see the value in sharing. One of our corporate cultures at FedEx is that because of all the different operating companies we have, because of the ground, because of the express, because of the freight, because of everything we do that's different, we run each of those companies as a separate organization. We call them operating companies. So we have 5 different operating companies, each of which are ran independently and reporting up through its own CEO. That CEO then reports up to our board of directors. What that causes, though, sometimes is silos. And while it's phenomenal that you have opportunities to cross those silos, at the highest levels, those silos tend to be fairly insulated. And by insulating those silos and not sharing the challenges that each of the operating companies has, what it can tend to do is create duplication. You have one senior executive team of an operating company working on a certain project, and you end up with 5 different projects that are very similar in nature versus having one corporation work on one project and funnel it down through the organization. In some ways that's good, in some ways that's bad. The most important way that it's bad is that it wastes resources. And as we all know today, resources are a precious commodity in the professional world. What happened at FedEx Kinkos when this happened was the fact that we had, a retail organization that requires, as in any retail organization, you're going to have turnover. And at the time, our retail turnover in our team members was about 30%, which is unheard of in FedEx Express. FedEx Express's turnover historically has been in single digits. They have a very loyal workforce. They take care of their team members again. But in a retail environment, retail turnover is going to be very much higher than that. Express didn't understand that. FedEx didn't understand that. And one of the things they came in and immediately cut at FedEx Kinko was our training budget. At one time, we had one of the most sought-after training resources and training teams in the entire retail world. We provided some of the best training to our team members throughout their careers at FedEx Kinkos of any retail company in the world. And we were very proud of that. And to see FedEx Express come in right after the merger and acquisition and eliminate that training budget because they didn't see the need for it, because they didn't see the need for it on their end of the organization, was a big blow to us. We had about 100 people in our training organization that were very valuable to us that the next day weren't here anymore because they eliminated the department. And what they saw after that was over the next 12 to 18 months, all of the great things that Kinko's had worked to build, all of the customer service that we gave, all of the training, all of the tenure that we had, it actually started going, instead of turnover coming down, it actually went up when we eliminated training. Because now we were no longer giving new team members the skills to take care of customers and to further their careers. We weren't, even though the express philosophy was PSP, take care of your people, training wasn't a part of taking care of their people because their turnover was so low and their tenure was so high. We have just now today, 5 years after the acquisition, gotten our training department at Kinko's back to where it was prior to the merger and acquisition. And that is something that, again, had there not been these silos at the top levels of management, the way we operate our company, could have very well been avoided if we had been able to get people to understand across operating companies what the differences are in your organization. The biggest part of the mergers and acquisitions as you go forward has to be the fact that it can't just be a bottom line. It cannot just be a financial decision. Today, the jury is still out on Wall Street whether or not Kinko's was a good acquisition from FedEx. For those of you that follow Wall Street, FedEx released our earnings last week, 2 weeks ago, and we posted our first quarterly loss in 11 years. Now, a couple of things. One, I look at that and I say 11 years is an awful good streak. To have 11 years, 44 straight quarters of posting a profit, there's a lot of companies that would like to have that. But when you have 44 straight quarters and you finally have a bad one, Wall Street tends to not look at it too fondly. Our 52-week high on our stock price is about $120. Friday it closed at $79, so we're about 33% off of our 52-week high. The economy certainly hasn't helped. We heard the talk about British Airways and the fuel prices. When you're the world's single largest airline and fuel's $140 a barrel, that's the primary reason we posted our first quarterly loss in 11 years. But you can't just look at things financially. If FedEx were looking at the Kinko's purchase strictly financially, they would probably agree with Wall Street and say, just looking at the Kinko's books and just looking at the $2 billion financial transactions that we have at Kinko's, they're not a successful acquisition. We would probably be on the selling block if that's the only reason that they were looking at it right now. However, there are underlying themes to the Kinko's purchase that FedEx is now starting to show the analysts as the analysts keep questioning the purchase. And one of those underlying aspects is that in buying 1,600 retail locations across the United States and the rest of the world, FedEx Express has actually taken in over $1 billion of package revenue through our storefronts. Now again, when we look at the companies and the fact that we operate independently, FedEx Kinkos, according to the U.S. Transportation and Railway Labor Act, FedEx Kinkos is not a transportation company. We weren't a transportation company when they bought us. We're not today. We operate independently. So since we're not a transportation company, we cannot realize shipping revenues. You have to be classified as a shipping company or a transportation company. So that $1 billion worth of revenue, we can't recognize on our books. However, FedEx realizes it, and because it's a retail storefront, it's retail customers walking in the front door, which are some of the highest margin packages in the entire FedEx chain. It's not the HPs of the world, it's not the IBMs of the world, it's not our commercial customers that have heavily discounted rates that are shipping thousands of packages a day. It's people walking into our stores that need to ship something overnight from one part of the country to the other one and are paying a higher retail rate for it. So FedEx understands and has always understood since the first day of the merger that that is one of the reasons that they were buying us. That our $2 billion worth of revenue may be a piece of the pie, but another 50% on top of that, $1 billion worth of additional revenue a year is flowing through their channels just simply by having retail storefronts. They had never publicized that fact until this earnings announcement that came out a couple of weeks ago. They finally published it for the first time because they knew that the analysts were going to have a field day with the fact that we posted our first quarterly loss in 44 years and that the Kinko's acquisition was going to come up again as a potential reason for this quarterly loss. So by actually coming out and saying there are reasons beyond the bottom line, there are reasons beyond financial means for a successful acquisition, what it helped do was help get some of the analysts to understand the reasons behind the merger and acquisition and why it actually has been a success, even with all of the challenges that I've detailed over the last few minutes in our discussion about our acquisition. Let me stop there for a second, as I've been up here for a little bit, and see if there are any questions or comments before we go on. Yes?
How did Kinko's approach branding before the merger, and what has changed after the merger?
That's actually good. That's a good segue. That was going to be the next part of my discussion. You may have heard, as part of that same earnings announcement, we're about to rebrand again. And this is something that is a hot topic right now, especially in Asia, given the relative strength of the two brands. Let's start with the first acquisition, or the acquisition 4.5 years ago. It was announced, and I still remember, I was in Houston, Texas at the time when we were first bought, and I got a call at about 4 o'clock in the morning that told me I needed to be on a 6 a.m. Central Time conference call, which is 7 a.m. East Coast time. Obviously, the conference call was scheduled that way so that the news would be broken to us before it was broken to Wall Street, because there was Mr. Smith had called a meeting with Wall Street at 8 o'clock that morning. So 7 o'clock in the morning, I get on the phone and I'm told, guess what, you now work for FedEx. Over the next 90 days after that call, we rebranded. At the time, we had 1,250 locations. We rebranded 1,250 locations in the United States. Express and Mr. Smith, couple of things. We wanted to keep the Kinko's name. In the United States, the Kinko's brand recognition is over 98%. If you poll 100 people in the United States, 98 of them will know what Kinko's was, what it did, what our services were. Interestingly enough, Express has about the same brand recognition, about the same 98%. So you had a merger of two extremely powerful brands. It will be interesting to see what Northwest and Delta does, for example. I don't believe that as they merge, they're going to merge the airline names. I think there will still be a Northwest and a Delta, at least from what I'm reading. But in many cases, when a smaller company is bought, especially a $40 billion company buying a $2 billion company, it becomes one company and the name goes away. The decision was made at the time because of the relative strength of the Kinko's brand and because of the popularity of our brand with our customers, the loyalty, and the fact that, again, FedEx had never been in a retail industry. The fear was that if we dropped the Kinko's name from our brand and rebranded it FedEx something else, then that brand recognition would go away and our revenues would suffer and the financial performance on the Kinko's company would suffer. I believe that was the correct decision. So at the time, the decision was made to brand the centers FedEx Kinko's Office and Print Centers versus Kinko's, which is what the previous name was. Even at the time, it was not announced then, but we all knew at Kinko's it was only going to be a matter of time, though, that we were able to keep that Kinko's name. I mentioned the other acquisitions. I mentioned the Express division buying Flying Tigers. I mentioned Ground buying Roadway. Those companies are not FedEx RPS. They're not FedEx Flying Tigers. They're FedEx Ground, FedEx Express, FedEx Freight. We all knew it was only going to be a matter of time before the Kinko's name would be dropped after there had been enough time to allow the consumers to believe that FedEx deserved the right to be in the retail space. And that's really what it was about, was buying enough time for FedEx, for the customers to tell us, okay, FedEx, it's okay to drop the Kinko's name now. We believe that you're FedEx Kinko's. We don't need to have the Kinko's name to be told that anymore. That's what happened in the announcement a couple of weeks ago. The same earnings announcement, we announced that FedEx Kinko's, effective immediately, is now going to be FedEx Office and Print Services. We dropped the Kinko's name basically 2 weeks ago. So the first rebranding announcement 4.5 years ago, the announcement came out and we immediately went to work tearing down the old Kinko's blue and red logo and putting up the new FedEx Kinko's logo at 1,250 locations. It was a fire drill. It was a lot of 22-hour days. It was a lot of construction people pulling their hair out. It was taking 20,000 team members and teaching them how to ship a FedEx package. Again, we had some counter space in some of our stores that we co-leased with FedEx, but those were counter spaces that had a FedEx team member in a Kinko center taking packages. It was a co-effort. It wasn't our team members. So we had to take 20,000 team members and 1,200 locations and teach them how to do FedEx and rebrand them FedEx. And it was everything. It was everything from our logos and our stationery to our storefronts and our retail locations, our signage in the front. And in 90 days, we literally ripped everything off the building that said Kinkos and put up something new that said FedEx Kinkos with our new logo on it. It was a massive effort, and it was about if I remember the math right, it was about a $20 million rebranding effort in that 90 days. Fast forward to the announcement a couple of weeks ago. We are changing our name, but we're going to do it in a much more economical fashion this time around. We have 1,600 stores in the United States right now. We have about another 150 worldwide. The decision to rebrand was announced, but we're going to take it in measured steps this time around because there's not the sense of urgency. We're not being bought now, we're just changing our name. We have 160 locations scheduled for retrofits or remodels in the U.S. this year. Those 160 stores will be rebranded this year. Over the next 4 years, the other 1,400 or 1,500 stores will be remodeled along a given schedule, and at that schedule they will be retrofitted with the new brand, but we're not going into it and remodeling them all immediately. And part of that's a financial decision. Obviously the economy's not in great shape today. We did post a quarterly loss. If we went and rebranded 1,600 stores today, we'd probably post another quarterly loss in the first quarter. We don't want to do that. Wall Street doesn't want us to do that. And at the end of the day, you do have to answer to Wall Street and your shareholders because they're putting money in your company and they expect a return from it. So the first time was a fire drill, 90 days. Every store in the world was remodeled. This time it's going to be a 4-year process, and we're going to do it in a much more organized manner, a much more cost-efficient manner.
Looking back, I wonder what you would have, particularly from a Kinko's point of view, what you might have liked to have seen from FedEx in terms of how they managed those losses coming into the.
You know, the biggest thing that I would have liked to have seen, and we've talked a lot about this at the director level above in my organization, was just an understanding of how you run a retail business. If you can imagine any retail business in Japan, any retail business in the world, retail businesses are run differently than corporate business. You have retail team members that are making 10 or 11 US dollars an hour, 1,000, 1,200 yen an hour. They're not college educated in many times. They're high school graduates with some secondary school or some university experience. You're not getting the same level of business understanding from a retail team member that you're going to get from somebody sitting in a corner office that has a college degree that has some business world experience. Everybody sitting in this room has probably worked for a corporate environment and would have a much better understanding of business changes when a merger and acquisition happens than somebody that's worked for a company like Kinko's for 20 years and is making $15 an hour, but is really just a frontline team member taking care of a customer walking up to a counter every day. And the fact that FedEx either chose not to understand that or we as Kinko's didn't impress upon them enough to make them understand it, I don't know which that was. I think there was an awe factor on the Kinko side, quite honestly, that FedEx is buying us, and while we're a great company at Kinko's, we're this big and FedEx is this big, and thank you for buying us, and we appreciate it. So I think there was some of that. I think we should have done a better job of pushing back to make them try to understand what it takes to manage a retail entity. But I also would have liked to have seen FedEx take a little bit more proactive approach to understanding that they didn't necessarily know how to run a retail organization and reach out for help. One of the things that we have done recently, our CEO, ex-CEO Kim May, decided to step down a couple of months back, was replaced by our COO, Brian Phillips, both of whom had come over to the Kinko side from the Express side throughout their careers. Brian Phillips is now in our CEO role, and finally, 4.5 years later, we have committed to going outside of our organization to look for a heavy-hitting COO with retail experience. We've committed to our shareholders and to our companies that we're going to bring in talent from the outside that has a pure retail background to help move the Kinko's part of our organization forward. So 4.5 years later, we've realized we need that retail management experience. I would have liked to have seen it a little earlier.
I want to know what was your biggest challenge when you came to Japan as a managing director?
Which one? Which challenge? The biggest challenge that I've seen, and this leads to the final part, actually it's a good segue to the final part of my speech today, is we've talked a lot about merging corporate cultures. One of the things with mergers and acquisitions that you have to be very careful of is merging country cultures. I have been in Japan for a year and a half. I absolutely love being in Japan. It's an amazing place to live. There are so many wonderful things about living here, but there are also some things that from a foreign culture in the business world don't necessarily make sense to me, and don't necessarily make sense to some of the other foreign directors that I've talked to. The Japan society, the Japan team members are very dedicated. They are very committed to each other, to their customers, to taking care of the business, but they are not necessarily prepared for what it means to work for a multinational organization. In multinational organizations, there are expectations for how you perform in your position, and if you fail to meet those expectations, then there is coaching and counseling that goes on, and there is accountability that's put in place, and there are ways to help increase a team member's skill level. But if a team member fails to take advantage of those and continues to perform at an unacceptable level, there are also ways to exit team members from companies. And you have to be very careful. One of the things that I've told my team in Japan over and over is that we are not here to make the team in Japan America-Light or an American team. We respect the culture in Japan. We respect the culture in Korea. We respect the culture in England and all the other countries we're in. But there are some corporate cultures that override what the country culture might be. And the biggest challenge that I have had is moving our team, not even at the team member level, but at the management level in Japan, past the country culture to understanding some of the corporate expectations. I see some heads nodding. Matter of fact, when I had an 8-hour meeting that I talked about that exact subject today, we, again, when you post your first quarterly loss in 44 months, the corporation decides that they want to do some things differently to make sure that that doesn't happen again, which includes some cost cutting and some other things that we've been given direction on. It wasn't taken too well today during our meetings, but it's a necessary part of the job. Our role as directors is to help them understand why that we have to make these moves, to try to get their buy-in, because one of the things that I have found is it's a little bit different in the U.S. It is helpful to explain things, but at the end of the day, the team members in the U.S., if you tell them this is something you need to do, they understand that if they don't do it, there's accountability. Here, if you tell them this is what you need to do, but you don't explain to them why you need to do it, then they're just going to choose not to do it in many cases. That's again, one of the things from a corporate versus country culture that you have to manage a little bit.
I work in technology, and you mentioned something about cutting costs, or operating costs, not operating costs, but support costs. In your organization, do you consider technology to be support costs or an operating cost?
We consider it to be both in a retail organization. We have parts of our IT organization that from a network and an infrastructure point of view, we couldn't run our stores without it. We have other parts, especially as a multinational corporation, that our support costs as you look at supporting business across the globe. One of the things that we do actually a very good job of at FedEx is managing our IT resources around the globe. Again, when we look at the fact that we're in 220 countries worldwide, a lot of those are third world countries that the nearest home that has internet may be 400 miles away, yet we figure out a way to make sure that we have IT remediation in all of our locations worldwide so that we have consistent data reporting. Part of that's Wall Street regulations. We have to be able to report our financial data at the drop of a hat, just like every other Wall Street publicly traded company does. But IT is certainly one that you really, there are some basic tenets of IT, and you have to have those, and there's certain things from a cost-cutting measure. There are things that would be nice to have from an IT perspective. We have actually a plan that was approved for FY09 to move to a VoIP solution for our phone networks, our telecommunications networks. That plan is now probably going to be pushed into FY10. That's a nice to have, but there are other IT pieces that are must-haves in order to report financial results and to be able to gather data that you need to run your business. So we look at it a little bit of both ways at FedEx.
I can understand FedEx mandating their culture, Kinkos, but was the pay package and different benefits also mandated, and how did that go over?
You know, that's one of the things with operating independently. Operating independently, while it does create some silos a little bit, it also allows the different operating companies to maintain some anonymity in pay packages and benefits. For example, the benefits provider that we use at Kinkos is not the same benefits provider that we use at Express, is not the same benefits provider that we use at Ground. Now it's that way because it's a legacy issue right now. I will tell you today, we are actually looking at, we've actually implemented a program in the last 90 days to look at all of these expenses and see where we can combine some things for savings, especially in benefits. But no, as a company that operates each of the operating companies independently, we were able to retain our own pay packages and benefits packages in each of the organizations throughout the mergers and acquisitions, and I believe that's worked well. Again, as you look at, especially on the Kinko side, buying a retail organization, retail pay structures are much different than professional pay structures, and it's been to our benefit to maintain that.
I think DHL is one of your best competitor.
Yes.
And DHL acquired a Japanese transportation company to expand their business structure
Yes.
here. Are you thinking, or do you have any plan to acquire a Japanese transportation company?
You know, I've talked to Ajiya-san, who is our Vice President of NorthPac here. He and I have weekly meetings, and he and I have discussed that a couple of times. I would love to see it happen, obviously, on the Kinko side. It would give us much greater penetration. I don't know that that will happen in Japan. We just bought a company in China within the last 6 months to expand our intra-country services in China, basically the equivalent of FedEx Ground in the U.S. Now we have a ground service in China. But in Japan, the intra-country shipping services, transportation companies are so ingrained, not only in the culture, but in the business, that it would be a difficult purchase. When you look at companies like Yamato and Sagawa, they are so ingrained in Japanese culture and in Japanese business, and they have such a heavy penetration that to buy one of those companies would probably be financially on order of the Kinko's purchase. It would probably take a couple of $1 billion to do an acquisition of one of those companies, and for a single country, intra-country option, I don't know that that would be worth it. I would love to see it happen personally. I don't think it's on the top of Mr. Smith's priority list, though. They do a great job, though. That's one of the things Moss and I talk about is how good of a job that Japan does with intra-country shipping. We were just talking about it before I came over here. I play golf a little bit. You know, you can ship a set of golf clubs to a golf course 100 miles from here round trip for 2,500 yen. In the U.S., one, I would never trust a shipping company with my golf clubs. Here, I don't even think twice about it. And two, there's no way we could do it for that type of margin. The margin on that is razor thin. So it's not something that we feel would be a return on our shareholder investment.
2 or 3 big things you can look forward to that you see happening in your particular industry. You know, you can take out the effects of the cash crunch at the moment, but you know, I don't expect corporate strategic secrets. But what can we look forward to seeing? 2 or 3 big predictions on your side of what you might see.
You know, on the express side, on the transportation side, there is talk about the current economic state lasting for up to another 12 months before it starts to turn back north. There is a big fear. We talked about the mergers and acquisitions of the airline earlier. There is a big fear right now, and again, we're the world's largest airline, so we have some insight into some of these discussions. There's a big fear right now, at least in the United States, that if the current environment continues to last for another 12 months, most of the airlines, Continental, Northwest Delta, United, most of them have enough cash on hand to continue to operate their business for 9 to 12 months, for 3 to 4 quarters. If the current environment stays the same as it is and oil continues to stay north of $130 a barrel, there's a large fear that one of those major airlines will go out of business, which is, from a business traveler perspective and from a freight perspective, because all of those airlines also move freight. There's a large fear that if one of them goes out of business, it could start a domino effect. But that's a big fear right now, is the health of the airline industry. And at Express, we look at it And again, on one hand, having a commercial airline go out of business would help us from a freight perspective because they all move freight. But from another perspective, it would actually hurt us because it would really cause a panic throughout the economy, and the economy would really go south. So one of the things that Mr. Smith talks about is making sure that that we take some of the speculation that's in the market today out of the market to help our competitors stay in business so that the economy continues to move north. Because if the economy goes south and the competitors go out of business, it will hurt us in the long run. So that's one thing is looking 12 months out and where's the price of oil going to be and what's going to happen to the airline industry. A second thing on the copy and print side, one of the things, there was a show, a technology show actually, in Drupa a couple of weeks ago in Germany. And there are some technologies that are being developed today that are really going to revolutionize the copy and print industry. From a product standpoint, black and white and color copies really haven't changed much over the last, well, black and white copies over the last 20 years, color copies over the last 15 years. There really hasn't been any new technological advances. Coming out of the show in Drupa a couple of weeks ago, we are very excited about some potential new technologies that we could be investing in, and they're really a game changer. Some of these, I can't go into a lot of specifics, but some of these technologies are going to cost upwards of $1 to $1.5 million to purchase. Today, in the environment that we're in the copy and print industry, in many of your offices, you probably have a copier on your floor that you can run down or you can send a file to, and you can print on your floor instead of having to send it to Kinko's. In the future, this technology, the price of this technology, the upfront investment won't allow that to happen. You're not going to be able to have $1 million copier on every floor, but the cost to operate the machinery is going to be such that it's going to be much more effective for companies to outsource their work to us than it is to insource it today, which is what the trend is. So technology is going to be a huge game changer in my industry in the next 5 years or so, and it's something I'm very excited about. The last one is really not a new prediction as much as one that I'll revisit a little bit. And 5 years ago in the industry, again, I've started with the company about 8 years ago. About 5 years ago, you started hearing the fact that Kinko's was going to go out of business, and companies like Kinko's was going to go out of business because everybody was sending things through email. Everybody was printing things in their office copier. We were going to be paperless in 5 to 10 years, is what everybody kept saying. The black and white and the color copy market, the size of the market, the number of copies that are being made every year has actually increased year over year each of those 5 years and doesn't show any signs of slowing down. So while everybody's predicting that the world's going to be paperless in X number of years, the data shows that's just not true. So one of the things that we are very excited about when you combine the fact that the market's still growing with this new technology and the financial advantages that that's going to give our company, it's a pretty exciting time to be in my business right now, which a lot of people wouldn't believe if I told them that.
How do you deal with recycling, or do you have a strategy for that, since you mentioned all the paper?
In Japan or worldwide?
Worldwide.
I say that kind of tongue-in-cheek. You know, one of the biggest surprises when I moved to Japan a year and a half ago, I knew how important recycling and sustainability was in the country of Japan. Again, we're in a country that 80% of the land mass in Japan is uninhabitable. It's mountainous. You know, we're living in 20% of the land mass in the country. That's why there's 10 million people in Tokyo. We separate our garbage at home. You know, I lived in Texas before I came over here. I'll shamefully admit that I never separated anything in Texas. We didn't care. I'm sorry. I know I'm terrible. When I moved to Japan with Kinko's, I was amazed to find out that we don't have a sustainability program in Japan, at my company. Absolutely floored me. How can any company in Japan not have a sustainability program when it's the right thing to do, when it's something you have to do in a country this size? We are working on implementing one here in our country. So from a recycling standpoint of the paper we use, that's one thing. Now the paper we buy, obviously at FedEx Kinko, we have close to 2,000 locations worldwide. We are the world's single largest procurer of paper goods, of cut sheet paper. That's a responsibility we take very seriously. We have a contract with a Forestry Services certified mill, actually several. So every piece of paper we buy comes from a environmentally, sustainably recycled forest. We're making sure that that from a electricity standpoint, we have received several green awards from companies in the United States that look for businesses that are greening their business. I'll go as far as to tell you, I was sharing this with him earlier, I looked at a company for Japan a couple of weeks ago as we were looking at providers named, actually I won't give you the name because I don't want to cloud anybody to their performance, but I looked at a company, and when I started looking at this company, realized they don't use Forestry Certified mills, and they're actually based in Indonesia, and there's a big uproar because they're cutting down all the trees in Indonesia, and they're not replacing them. They have another vendor that I know of that I talked to that had just fired them because of the same deal, so we obviously didn't choose them either. A company as large as ours, especially with the FedEx name on our door, we have to be environmentally friendly. Today there's such a push to do business with companies that are trying to sustain the environment that if you choose not to do that, you choose to go out of business in essence because customers will stop using you.
Could there ever be, could there ever be a crisis with paper, the way there is with oil, for example?
In theory, sure, there could be, but one of the things you look at when you plant a tree, it's generally going to be 20 years before you cut it down to make pulp out of it. Forestry Certified has really become the rage in the last 10 years. So we have some immature forests that are out there that are still being grown. So even though we're using Forestry Certified paper and there's these Forestry Certified mills, there's still the trees that they've replanted, the trees that are regrowing to cut down again and managing their forestry are still fairly immature. So given that and the fact that there's probably another 10 years before we catch up with kind of where this started 10 years ago to be the rage. In theory, it's possible, but I don't believe it'll happen. There's more threat to the forestry environment from real estate and from construction than there is from the paper industry, quite frankly. And that's one of the problems that they're finding right now is that not necessarily in the United States or in developed countries, but in the emerging countries like China, where they're building things at a rapid pace, especially housing, that this Forestry Certified is kind of going by the wayside. So there is some concern in some of those countries.